Hello, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. Happy New Year, my lovelies. I hope your holidays were safe and that you are feeling well rested. I'm back at my day job, and it is a feeling, that is for sure. Hopefully, those of you who are returning to work are settling in nicely, and those of you that have worked through the holiday are taking a much needed break. Seriously, give it up for the retail workers who did the damn thing through the hardest time of the year, putting up with those who need to learn manners. Bonus points if you didn't stab anyone. You're the goat. You are seriously the goat. Today we are looking into a cold case that appears to have possibly been solved last year. This is what you should know about the Somerton Man. In the early hours of December 1st, 1948, police were contacted when the body of a man was discovered in Somerton Park, which is located near Glenelg in South Australia. The man was found sitting in the sand with his head and back resting against the seawall. His legs were extended and feet were crossed. Initially, it was believed the man had died while sleeping. But as this goes on, it is proven that is not the case, and it is in fact much sadder. Found on his body was an unlit cigarette on the right collar of his coat, an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a bus ticket from the city that may not have been used, a narrow aluminium comb that had been manufactured in the USA, a half-empty packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, an army cigarette packet which contained 7 cigarettes of a different brand, and a quarter-full box of Bryant and May matches. A witness came forward saying that on the evening of November 30th, they had seen what they believed to be the dead man lying on his back on the same spot. A couple who saw him at around 7 p.m. noted they saw him extend his right arm to its fullest extent and then drop it limply, and assumed that on the cusp of summer that he may have just had too much to drink and needed to sleep it off. Another couple saw him from 7:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., during which the street lights had come on. They recounted that they did not see him move during the half an hour which he was in view, although they did have the impression that his position had changed. Thus, he must have moved when they weren't looking, or at least so they believed. But they did comment to each other that it was odd that he was not reacting to mosquitoes. They thought, much like the first couple, that it had been more than likely that he was drunk or asleep, and because of this they did not investigate any further. One witness told the police that she observed a man looking down at the sleeping man from the top of the stairs that led to the beach, and witnessed the said body was in the same position when the police viewed it. It was reported by John Burton Cleland. The man was of Britisher appearance and thought he was aged about 40 to 45 and was in top physical condition. He was 180 centimeters tall, or 5'11", with grey eyes, fair to ginger-coloured hair, and was slightly grey around the temples, with broad shoulders and a narrow waist. His hands and nails showed no signs of manual labour. Big and little toes met in a wedge shape, like those of a dancer or someone who wore boots with pointed toes, and pronounced high calf muscles, consistent with people who regularly wore boots or shoes with high heels or to perform ballet. He was dressed in a white shirt, a red, white and blue tie, brown pants, socks and shoes, a brown knitted pullover, and fashionable grey and brown double-breasted jacket, reportedly of American tailoring. All labels on his clothes had been removed, and he had no hat, which was quite unusual for 1948. He also had no wallet. The Somerton Man was clean-shaven and carried no identification, which led police to believe he had committed suicide. Finally, his dental records were not able to be matched to any known person. An autopsy was conducted, and the pathologist estimated that the time of death was around 2 or 1 a.m. on December the 1st, likely meaning that those who saw him lift his arm may have been able to save him if they had called for help. His heart was a normal size and healthy. Small vessels, not commonly observed in the brain, were easily discernible. There was an obstruction of the throat, and the gullet was covered with a whitening of superficial layers of the mucous membrane, with a patch of ulceration in the middle of it. Or to put it in a much easier way to understand, it looked like he had a chemical burn to his throat. There was blood mixed with food in his stomach. Both kidneys were severely damaged. The liver contained a great excess of blood in its vessels, and the spleen was strikingly large, around 3 times the normal size. The autopsy also showed that the man's last meal was a pasty eaten about 3 or 4 hours before his death, but tests failed to reveal any foreign substance in the body. The pathologist, Dr. Dwyer, was quoted as saying, "I'm quite convinced the death could not have been natural. The poison I suggested was a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic." So to translate, he likely died of a drug overdose. Barbiturates and soluble hypnotics are these days typically found in antidepressants and sedatives like Xanax. And as far as suicide goes, if you have these types of drugs at your disposal and are determined to leave this life, it really wouldn't be that hard to achieve. That being said, if you are struggling with your mental health, please reach out for help. It does get better. It is just a long path. I will be putting more mental health links in the show notes. But I digress. Poisoning remained a prime suspicion, but his last meal was not believed to be the source. But even with those strong starting points for an investigation into what happened, the coroner was unable to reach a conclusion on the man's identity, or whether the man seen alive on Somerton Beach on the evening of November 30th was the same man, as nobody had seen his face at that time. The body was embalmed on the 10th of December, 1948, after police were unable to get a positive identification. With this action, they created a death mask to keep a fresh version of the man's face to show to the public. Progress did continue, as on the 14th of January, 1949, towards the end of World War II, staff at the Adelaide railway station discovered a brown suitcase with its label removed. The suitcase had been checked into the train station cloakroom after 11 a.m. on the 30th of November, 1948, and was believed to be owned by the man found on the beach. In the suitcase was a red checkered dressing gown, a size 7 red felt pair of slippers, 4 pairs of underpants, pajamas, shaving items, a light brown pair of trousers with sand in the cuffs, an electrician's screwdriver, a table knife cut down into effectively what is a shiv, a pair of scissors with sharpened points, a small square of zinc thought to be used as a case for the knife and scissors, and a stenciling brush, the same kind used by third officers on merchant ships for stenciling cargo. There was also a thread card of Barber brand orange waxed thread, which was not available in Australia, and was additionally used to repair the lining in a pocket of the trousers the dead man was wearing. All identification marks on the clothes had been removed, but police found the name T. Keane, with Keane spelt as Keane on a tie, Keane on a laundry bag, and Keane spelt Kean on a singlet along with 3 dry cleaning marks. Initially, police believed someone must have removed the tags from the clothing in an attempt to hide the man's identity. However, must have overlooked these 3 items or purposely left the Keane tags on clothes, knowing Keane was not his name. As I mentioned, World War II was still going and would finally conclude in September of 1949. Due to this fact, there was still wartime rationing being enforced, and clothing was difficult to attain at this time. Although it was a widespread practice to use name tags to effectively stake their claim to the items, and it was also common when buying second-hand clothing to remove the tags of the previous owners. But what was unusual in this situation was that there were no spare socks found in the case, and no correspondence, even though police found pencils and unused stationery. Police knuckled down and started searching to see if there was anyone by that name considered missing. However, there was no T. Keane missing in any English-speaking country. Next, they moved to the dry cleaning marks, but this also had no desirable outcome. All that could be gathered from the suitcase and feather stitching on the coat that was amongst the belongings was that it indicated that they had been manufactured in the United States. The belief became that the man on the beach was not from Australia. As this continued, police checked incoming train records and believed the man had arrived at the Adelaide railway station overnight, either from Melbourne, Sydney, or Port Augusta. They also speculated that they had showered and shaved at the adjacent city baths before returning and purchasing a ticket for the 10:50 a.m. train to Henley Beach, which he either missed or just decided to not catch. The man on the beach had immediately checked his suitcase at the station cloakroom before leaving the station and catching a bus to Glenelg. Police were taking necessary steps to identify the man on the beach and requested information from the public. Calls had come in, and on the 12th of February, a brief news article posted saying, Harry Kearns, whom detectives thought might be the unknown man from Somerton Beach in South Australia on December 1st, has reported to the CIB office here. Kearns left Kalgoorlie in 1945. He said today he had been working in the northwest and returned only recently to Kalgoorlie. He read a newspaper story that he might be the man at Somerton and reported to the police immediately. This gem was posted next to a large cigarette advertisement for a brand I have honestly never heard of called Turf. I admit it did make me laugh a little bit. Must have been a slow news day. Time continued, and the inquest into the man's death conducted by coroner Thomas Cleland. The coroner re-examined the body and made multiple discoveries. The man's shoes were remarkably clean and appeared to have been recently polished, rather than in the condition expected of a man who had been walking around all day. He added that this evidence fitted with the theory that the body may have been moved to Somerton Park Beach after the man's death, which would account for the lack of evidence of vomiting and convulsions, which are the two typical reactions to poison. Dr. Cleland speculated that as none of the witnesses could positively identify the man they saw the previous night as the same person discovered the next morning, thus giving life to the possibility that the man may have died elsewhere and had been dumped on Somerton Beach. However, he explicitly stressed that this was purely speculation, as all the witnesses believed it was definitely the same person. During this inquest, Dr. Cleland was in contact with Cedric Stanton Hicks, a professor of physiology and pharmacology at the University of Adelaide. Professor Hicks provided him with a list of 2 drugs that could have been the cause of the death. This information was not made public for a further 30-odd years, which is quite a wait. Both drugs were extremely toxic in relatively small oral doses that would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify, even if it had been suspected in the first instance. Both were quite easy to buy from a chemist without prescription or the need to give a reason for the purchase. These drugs were digitalis and albane, both cardinalide type cardiac glycosides. Professor Hicks stated that if death had occurred 7 hours after the man was last seen to move, it would imply a massive dose that still could have been undetectable. So those original witnesses probably weren't able to save him, even if they had called an ambulance. The movement seen by witnesses at 7 p.m. may have been the last convulsions before death. Despite the knowledge given by Professor Hicks, Dr. Cleland could not determine the cause of death of the unidentified man, and remarked that if the body had been carried to its final resting place, all the difficulties would disappear. During the inquest, a small piece of rolled-up paper with the words Tamam Shud printed on it was found in a fob pocket that was sewn within the dead man's trouser pocket. Public library officials called in and translated the text. The phrase meant ended or finished, and was found on the last page of the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. The police appealed to the public to help locate the copy of the Rubaiyat from which the page had been torn from. In response, a man reported to the police and showed them a 1941 edition of Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat published by Whitecomb and Tombs in Christchurch, New Zealand. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean, who was the lead of the initial investigation, often protected the privacy of witnesses in public statements by using pseudonyms. Detective Lean referred to the man who found the book by the pseudonym Ronald Francis. This man was never formally identified. Ronald, as we shall keep calling him, had not considered that the book might be connected to the case until he had seen an article in the newspaper. It isn't overly clear how this book was found. In one newspaper article, it was said the book had been found about a week or two before the body was found. Former South Australian police detective Jerry Feltus, who had worked on this case as a cold case, reports the book was found just after the man was found on Somerton Beach. However, in multiple other podcasts, I have heard that the book was found in the backseat of a car, having been thrown through an open window, or that the back door had been unlocked and they had opened the door and put the book in the back seat. Timing has to be considered carefully, with the finding of the book, as if put against the timeline surrounding all other evidence, there is no way the book could have been found 2 weeks prior, unless the man had visited previously or had been in Adelaide for a longer period, which, knowing what has now been confirmed, and a further point I have been dwelling on while researching, does not line up or make sense. There was a handwritten text at the back of the rubaiyat. This text was presumed to be some sort of code, which later would bring up discomfort at the thought of the deceased man potentially being a spy. But to consider the meaning of the poetry book, it is that one should live life to the fullest and have no regrets when it ends. But we all know poetry is subjective to the reader, and while it could be intended to be seen that way, the reader could have taken a more depressing tone from, and this is what led police to theorize that the man had committed suicide by poison, even though no evidence validated this theory. The page with the words Tamam Shud was forensically determined to have come from the book that was turned in. Also, in the back of the book were faint indentations representing 5 lines of texts in capital letters. In 1978, Department of Defense cryptographers analyzed the handwritten text, and in response, they reported that it would be impossible to provide a satisfactory answer. Some have suggested it could have been shorthand for placing bets on horses or dogs. In 2004, retired detective Jerry Feltus suggested in a Sunday Mail article that the final line that reads ITTMTSAMSTGAB could stand for the initials "It's time to move to South Australia, Mosley Street." But why would this have been written in code? Why would he have wanted to permanently locate to Glenelg? This would be because of a potential connection found through a woman known as Jessica Thompson. A telephone number was found at the back of the book belonging to a nurse named Jessica Ellen Jo Thompson, who lived in Mosley Street, Glenelg, about 400 metres north of where the body was found. When police interviewed Jessica, she told them that she did not know the dead man or why he would have her phone number and why he would choose to visit her suburb the night of his death. But then she told a strange incident in late 1948. According to Jessica, an unidentified man had attempted to visit her and asked the next door neighbour about her. Former detective Jerry Feltus wrote in his book, The Unknown Man, A Suspicious Death at Somerton Beach, that when he interviewed Jessica in 2002, that she was either being evasive or just did not want to talk about it. Former Detective Feltus believed that Jessica knew the Somerton man's identity. Even Jessica's daughter, Kate, believed so, and in a television interview in 2014 with Channel 9's 60 Minutes, also said she believed her mother knew the dead man. But during the start of the investigation in 1949, Jessica requested that the police not keep a permanent record of her name or release her details to third parties, as it would be embarrassing and harmful to her reputation to be linked to such a case. You can honestly hear the ghost of her pearls being clutched with that statement. Police agreed, which ended up being a decision that would hamper later investigations. When Jessica was shown the plaster cast bust of the dead man by Detective Lean, she said she could not identify the person depicted. However, according to Detective Lean, her reaction upon seeing the cast as completely taken aback to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. In an interview many years later, Paul Lawson, who is the technician who made the cast and was present when Jessica viewed it, according to him, after looking at the bust, she immediately looked away and would not look at it again. This to me does seem a little suspicious unless you want to consider the fact that perhaps he looked like someone she knew and was fighting in the war at the time. Which could have been the case considering the fact Jessica also mentioned that she was working out of the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney during World War II. She had owned a copy of the Rubaiyat. In 1945, at the Clifton Gardens Hotel in Sydney, she had given it to an Australian Army lieutenant named Alf Boxall. But this is where it gets a little messy, as she then told police that after the war ended, she had moved to Melbourne and married. While in Melbourne, she had received a letter from Lieutenant Boxall and had replied telling him that she was now married. The messy part is that the research suggests that her future husband, Prosper Thompson, was in the process of obtaining a divorce from his first wife in 1949, and that he did not marry Jessica until mid-1950. And there is no evidence that Lieutenant Boxall had any contact with Jessica Thompson after 1945. That being said, just because we can't find the paper trail does not mean it didn't happen that way. She may have used the term married loosely to prevent the lieutenant from pursuing her further. I mean, come on. I can guarantee you, just about every woman on the face of this planet has used the excuse, "I have a boyfriend," to get a man to leave them alone. Due to these conversations, police suspected that Lieutenant Boxall was the dead man. However, in July 1949, Lieutenant Boxall was found in Sydney, and the final page of his copy of the Rubaiyat was still intact. Lieutenant Boxall was now working in the maintenance section at the Randwick bus depot and was unaware of any link between himself and the dead man. 6 months after the body on the beach had been found, a potential connection was flagged with the police regarding the death of a 2-year-old boy named Clive Magnuson, who was found in a sack in the Largs Bay sandhills, about 20 kilometres from the coast from Somerton Man. Lying next to him was his unconscious father, Keith Magnuson. Despite what seemed like a disturbing plot to cover up Keith's attempt to identify the Somerton Man and the fact his son appeared to have died from a barbiturate overdose, it was far simpler than what was initially assumed, as Keith had poor mental health and decided he wanted to exit this world and wanted to take his young son with him. Unfortunately, what made this so disturbing was the sheer amount of hoax calls threatening violence. People really are sick, and this event is really just so sad, but also not connected in any way at all. In 1949, the body of the unknown Somerton Man was buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery, and the Salvation Army conducted the service. It was by the generosity of the South Australian Grandstand Bookmakers Association, who paid for the service to save the man from a pauper's burial, which, as grim as this has all been, is such a kind gesture. Further strange occurrences and reports started cropping up, including years after the burial, flowers began appearing on the grave. Police questioned a woman leaving the cemetery, but she claimed she knew nothing of the man. Around the same time, Ina Harvey, the receptionist from the Strathmore Hotel opposite the Adelaide railway station, reported to the police that a strange man had stayed in room 21 or 23 for a few days, around the time of the death, checking out on November 30th, 1948. When asked, she recalled that he was English-speaking and only carried a small black case. When an employee looked inside the case, he told Ina he had found an object inside the case that he described looked like a needle. On the 22nd of November 1959, it was reported that E.B. Collins, an inmate of New Zealand's Wanganui prison, claimed that he knew the identity of the dead man. However, much like most other people, this led nowhere. In 1994, John Harbour Phillips, Chief Justice of Victoria and Chairman of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, reviewed the case and determined the cause of death and concluded that there seems little doubt that it was digitalis. The South Australian Police Historical Society holds the plaster bust, which contains strands of the man's hair. The hairs in the bust are the only remaining DNA evidence, as the embalming formaldehyde would have destroyed much of the man's DNA. Shockingly, other key evidence no longer exists, as the brown suitcase was destroyed in 1986. In addition, witness statements have disappeared from the police file over the years. I nearly ripped out a chunk of hair as I was reading what happened to the suitcase, because this is not a situation of the case being misplaced or accidentally destroyed in a fire. Former Detective Fultus has allegedly claimed the suitcase was destroyed as being of no use in 1986. It honestly seems bizarre that they would destroy any evidence from a cold case. Honestly, someone needs a spanking after that. But onto the spy theories before I burst a blood vessel. Due to the strange circumstances surrounding the Somerton man's death and the war that was happening, there was a persistent speculation that he was a spy. There are at least 2 sites relatively close to Adelaide that were of interest to spies: the Radium Hill uranium mine and the Woomera Test Range, an Anglo-Australian military research facility. His death overlapped with the reorganisation of the Australian security agencies, which would conclude the following year with the founding of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, also known as ASIO. This would then be followed by the restriction on Soviet espionage in Australia, which was revealed by intercepts of Soviet communications under the Venona project. Which is just bananas to me. Who knew Adelaide was that interesting? Certainly not any bands that tend to tour. Another theory concerns Lieutenant Boxall allegedly being involved in intelligence work during and immediately after World War II. This was so deeply believed that in 1978 TV interview, Stuart Littlemore asked the following: "Mr. Boxall, you had been working, hadn't you, in an intelligence unit before you met this young Jessica. Did you talk to her about that at all?" In reply, Lieutenant Boxall replied with a simple no, and when asked if Jessica could have known, he was quoted as replying with, "Not unless somebody told her." Then it was suggested that there may have been an espionage connection to the dead man in Somerton. Lieutenant Boxall responded by saying, "It's quite a melodramatic thesis, isn't it?" But a breakthrough in this case would not start until 2009, when a University of Adelaide team led by Professor Derek Abbott began an attempt to solve the case and proposed to exhume the body to test for DNA. While pending approval for the exhumation, Professor Abbott and his team started diving into the evidence they could. After all this time, what damage could it really do? It was determined that letter frequency of the encryption in the back of the book was different from letters written down randomly, and the frequency was to be further evaluated to determine if alcohol level of the writer could alter random distribution. It was also considered that the format of this code was also followed the Quatern format of Rubaiyat, leading them to speculate the code was a one-time pad encryption system. Not only did they use the Rubaiyat, but also the Talmud and Bible were being compared to the code using computers to get base for letter frequencies. However, due to the code being so short, it meant they required the exact edition of the book being used at the time. Sadly, the original copy was lost in the 1950s, and researchers would need to find a Fitzgerald edition. The team concluded that it was most likely each letter was the first letter of a word. As the team continued their investigation, they found that the Somerton Man's autopsies reports from 1948 and 1949 are now missing, and the Bar Smith Library's collection of Dr. Cleland's notes do not contain anything on the case. Images of the Somerton Man's ears were examined by Marche Henneberg, a professor of anatomy at the Adelaide University. During this, they found that his Simba so the upper ear hollow is larger than his cavum, which is the lower ear hollow. This feature is possessed by only 1 to 2% of the Caucasian population. Investigating further, Professor Abbott consulted with dental experts who concluded that the Somerton Man had hypodontia, which is a rare genetic disorder of both lateral incisors, a feature present in only 2% of the general population. Due to the strange and secretive connection between Jessica and the Somerton Man, Professor Abbott obtained a picture of Jessica's son, Robin, in 2010. This image clearly showed that he not only had a larger cimba than cavum, but also hypodontia. The chance of this being a coincidence is estimated between 1 in 10 million and 1 in 20 million, which is just insane. It was suggested in the media that Robin Thompson, who was 16 months old in 1948 and passed away in 2009, may have been either a child of Lieutenant Boxall or the Somerton Man, and was instead passed off as Prosper Thompson's son. The only way to be 100% certain, however, would be to conduct a DNA test, which was done through ancestral DNA. Professor Abbott contacted Rachel, the daughter of Robin Thompson, who had been adopted and grew up in New Zealand. Quite the meet cute actually, because Professor Abbott and Rachel married in 2010 and now have 3 children. However, Rachel Egan's DNA had been analysed and the links were found to her grandparents of Prosper Thompson. In December of 2017, Professor Abbott announced 3 excellent hairs at the right development stage for extracting DNA had been found on the plaster cast, aka the death mask. These hairs were submitted for analysis to the Australian Centre of Ancient DNA at the University of Adelaide. While the majority of the DNA is degraded, in February of 2018 the University of Adelaide team obtained a high-definition analysis of the mitochondrial DNA from the hair sample of the Somerton Man. However, mitochondrial DNA is only inherited through the maternal line, therefore took the option of searching surnames out of the equation. In July of 2022, Professor Abbott announced that he and genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick had finally found the identity of the Somerton Man, and his name was Carl, also Charles, Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker who was born in November 1905 in Footscray, Melbourne. The Webb family allegedly had no idea of their connection to the long-running mystery, though there were stories of a missing family member many years before. While I believe the living family members weren't aware of the connection, I am slightly suspicious of those who were alive when Carl went missing. I mean, this was even a big case when the body was found, and there were hundreds of people in Victoria calling in, stating that it could have been someone they knew, even though it was all disproved at the end of the day. As it seems to go in modern-day true crime, the Webb family had put their family tree together on a genealogical website. I could not find anything to suggest that it did include a DNA kit similar to Ancestry.com, but honestly I wouldn't be surprised. Professor Abbott contacted Stuart Webb, who was believed to be the great-grandson of the Somerton Man's brother. Stuart was quoted as saying the following in the Australian Story. Professor Abbott asked me if I was related to Norman Webb, who's my grandfather, and that led to a whole series of questions about my heritage, whether there's any family photos or family histories that I can recall. Stuart and his Aunt Julie searched through old family albums and found a group photo which may have contained an image of Carl. The image of 19 smiling faces of all ages was titled, "At a Fantastic Family Day." Unfortunately, Stuart and Julie weren't sure which of them was Carl until roughly a week later, when he noticed that 2 of the album's pages were stuck together. If you have ever had an old family album, you know that this does happen, and while it's nerve-wracking to pull them apart, it does make quite a satisfying peeling sound. Between the stuck pages was another family photo. This time, the names were penned on the actual photo itself. Grandpa, Grandma, Roy, and Charlie. Stuart was thrilled to have found this image and referred to his excitement like being on a treasure hunt. With the knowledge of which face belonged to Carl, he went back to the larger family photo and was able to identify him as the young man in the back row to the far right. Stuart's sister, Christy Webb, volunteered to do a saliva test and was found to be right in the middle of the range of a DNA match, according to Professor Abbott. This confirmed that they were in fact relations of Carl Webb. For Stuart and Christy, it was bittersweet to discover their family's connection to the case. Christy's reaction was mixed, and she was quoted as saying, "It was happiness, it was joy, but there was sadness to this forgotten family member. This was a person. He wasn't just a media hit for a little while and an unsolved mystery. He was our family." The wild part to me is when looking at a picture of Stuart Webb, you can definitely see the family resemblance. And so the Somerton Man, Carl Webb, can finally go home. But this is not where I leave you, because there are still questions, which can all be boiled down to a simplified why. And to answer that, we are going to investigate the life and history of Carl Webb. Of Germanic descent, Carl was the youngest of 6 children. The 3 sons would eventually work at their family bakery, and when the bakery closed, Carl trained to be an electrical instrument maker. In 1941, he married Dorothy Robertson, a pharmacist and chiropodist. Their marriage would not last long, but the young couple moved into a flat in South Yarra, Victoria. To put it bluntly, the marriage was turbulent due to Carl's personality, which after reading through further sounded like he had many mental issues that were not being tended to. Dorothy described her husband as isolated, having next to no friends, and living a quiet life with a routine of being in bed by 7 p.m. each night. This alone would not have been an issue. There is nothing wrong with a quiet life void of drama. However, he was also moody, violent, and threatening, especially when facing defeat in any matter. So effectively, he was an oversized child. In the research of this, I did come across divorce papers that were lodged in 1951 under the basis of desertion. But to get a better understanding, I will read a few points, as the way I would have worded it does not really show how abusive Carl really was. I get it. It was the way things were in the 1940s, but honestly, it saddens me, because this behavior still carries on in abusers of any gender today. In point 10, Dorothy explains the first 18 months of marriage, and the document reads as follows. Since the said marriage, the respondent had always been of a moody disposition. He would be perfectly reasonable for a time, but without any apparent cause, he would completely ignore people and quite often be rude. Even early in our marriage, he sometimes refused to speak to me for hours on end. Small things led to quarrels. For several weeks, shortly after our marriage, I nursed the respondent's mother. This resulted in my being run down in health. Nevertheless, respondent expected me to resume my employment. During the first 18 months of our married life, I had almost 12 months in the home, but that was most miserable for me, as I was allowed money only for food and no new clothes of any kind, as the respondent told me I was not earning. I went back to business and was expected to hand my pay to the respondent and account for any expenses paid out of my earnings. I found myself working all hours and caring for a home. I had several illnesses, and the respondent was very displeased at my spending money on doctor's bills. From that alone, you can see the kind of relationship that was had between Dorothy and Carl, one that was filled with aggression and spite from Carl. But unfortunately, it does not get any better, as the relationship continued, and in point 11, Dorothy continues on to explain the issues she faced with Carl's need to gamble. The main part of this point is quoted as following. The respondent used to bet on the races. If he lost, he would be sullen and rude to me or anyone else. If he lost cards, he would become unpleasant to everyone, and on one night in the year 1945, he threw his hand on the table and went to bed without saying a word. One night in the year 1945, when he was losing, he got a long-bladed carving knife and threatened a guest who had won a lot of money from him. This led to breaking up old friendships of mine. This document is honestly heartbreaking, and it continues with the theme of abuse and untreated depression. She continues on to explain how he was fond of poetry and wrote several poems of his own, most of them on the subject of death, which allegedly claimed to be his greatest desire. Dorothy recalled in March of 1946, in which her husband apparently attempted suicide with an overdose of ether and phenobarbital. Dorothy was a kind woman, as this had been after multiple violent outbursts from Carl where he would hit her. She nursed him back to health. During this time, he continued to threaten her, saying that if she called a doctor or if he got better, he would kill her. In September of 1946, Dorothy fled from her husband. To me, I am honestly in awe of her strength, not just because leaving an abuser is insanely dangerous, but because it was almost completely unheard of for a woman to leave her husband during that time, no matter what. In 1947, Carl moved out and went off the radar after that, just gone without a trace. The divorce was granted in April of 1952, but the part to this that is wild is that she moved to Butte in South Australia, and Professor Abbott theorized that Carl had possibly tried to track her down, which is why he ended up in South Australia where he died. But what about the American items and the name Keene? Glad you asked. Carl's older sister, Frida Grace, was married to Thomas Gerald Keene, aka T. Keene. They had a son named John who died in World War II in 1943, which, sadly, Carl's brother Roy also died in battle that same year. John's possessions included items which suggested he resided in the US at one point, such as US coins and a map of Chicago. Frida and Carl lived about a 20-minute drive away from each other, and after the breakdown of his marriage, Carl likely either stayed with his sister or was handed down the American items, and items with the name Keene on it. Professor Abbott's research reflects what is said in the divorce papers from Dorothy about Carl enjoying betting on the horses, and now suggested, as I stated earlier, that the coded message could have been horse names. Derek Abbott and Colleen Fitzpatrick believe that Carl had serious mental health issues and spiraled down after losing 4 close relatives in 7 years. His history and the autopsy suggest that he committed suicide by poisoning himself. I do wonder how he went unnoticed as missing for so long. Understandably, Dorothy just wanted to distance herself and start her life fresh in South Australia, and due to it not being easy to track a person down in that time, she likely didn't keep an ever-vigilant eye out. However, I wonder how she missed all the requests for information that would have been coming out in South Australia for the Somerton Man. She may not have purchased any newspapers, but surely, with people being eternally morbidly curious, someone would have brought up the incident to her. And then there's the consideration for his sister, Frida Grace. The information on what had been found on him was posted publicly. And if we go with the assumption that people had always been morbidly curious, surely she would have seen it, or someone who knew her and her family would have brought it up. But these are answers we will not get, as everyone around during that time with the ability to remember would either be so old that their memory would now be failing, or they would have since passed on. Either he flew under the radar completely for those who did know him, or those who did know him noticed and just did not care. Which, honestly, considering he sounds like a scoundrel, I'm not surprised. But on that note, that is all I have for you today. As always, I'll be posting relevant images on Instagram and Facebook at What You Should Know Australia. If you want to reach out to me to request an episode, you can message me there or send me an email to whiskerpod@gmail.com. But until next time, my lovelies, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!